Good evening. CrossCurrents is produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Mary Dietrich, the moderator for tonight's program. This fall, Colorado voters will be asked to consider several amendments and statutes. It could become a confusing and very complicated effort. The League of Women Voters is committed to being a source of information for voters on these issues and more. So we hope that you have joined us tonight or on the web to learn about raising funds to meet what has been called a financial crisis crossroads for Colorado's public schools. Last week, Brighton 27J School District, just outside of Denver, joined 104 other school districts in Colorado in moving to a 4-day school week. Transportation, facilities, teacher shortages are among the reasons why the percentage of our schools moving to this structure has almost doubled in the last 10 years. Brighton is the first urban school district to make this change. What has brought Colorado school funding to this point? And is Amendment 73 the right solution to fund our schools? It's a complicated situation and a complicated solution. While we will attempt to give some background tonight on the why this measure has been placed on the ballot, we're going to try to focus on the amendment itself, its various parts, and its possible effects on our schools, our tax system, and our communities and citizens. For more information and more background on this issue, I encourage you to visit the CrossCurrents page on our website at www.lwv-larimercounty.org for a program we produced last spring on this topic. Thanks this evening to Cathy Kipp, member of the Poudre School District School Board, and Steve Miller, Larimer County Tax Assessor, for joining us as we try to explain the pros and cons of Amendment 73. Good evening. Cathy, can you tell us why you're here tonight?
Well, I've been on the school board now for nearly 7 years, and one of the things that we continue to do in Colorado as school board members is advocate for funding for our schools because they've been chronically underfunded for literally decades. We need to do better by our kids, and really the only way we have found to make a big difference is in getting more revenue for education. Because of the constraints that are contained in the Colorado Constitution, we don't have a good other way of doing it. So that's why I'm here. Okay.
Steve, what's your interest in Amendment 73?
Well, I'm the county assessor, so I kind of deal with property tax a lot. My interest in Amendment 73, formerly known as Initiative 93, is in the complexity of it. And I think they've made some fairly serious mistakes in the structuring of what they've gone for. They go for, they meaning, I guess, superintendents designed it, but it's for the, whoever is involved in public education in Colorado. They have a very large income tax component. An increase that I think is $1.6 billion in total. And if they had stopped there, I think it would have been fine. But then they go into property tax. And assessors are always interested in what happens in property tax. And they've introduced some changes that I don't think make anything better.
Okay, thanks, Steve. We'll get into that in more detail in a few minutes. Okay, first some serious background on why Colorado schools need more money. I understand that we rank almost 50th in some categories in school funding and 39th in others in the nation. And in some ways, a lot of people would say our schools are doing fine. Why do they need more money? Cathy, what do you want to throw in?
Well, if you look at the attached slide, that's the first one there. It shows that we're over $2,300 below the national average in Colorado in how we fund our schools. That's per pupil revenue per year. We feel like we're not there. We still are trying to get back to 86 levels of funding. That was what Amendment 23 was trying to do, and we've been able to do that. Could you go to the next slide, please? That's up there describing the negative factor. The negative factor, also known as the budget stabilization factor, is what happened when the Great Recession came along in our legislature, because Amendment 23, which was passed in the year 2000 and was trying to get us back to 1986 levels of education funding in Colorado, when the Great Recession came along, they basically decided we didn't have enough money to follow Amendment 23, and so they came up with a loophole and said, well, we don't have to apply Amendment 23 to all of education funding. We only need to fund it to the base portion, not to the factors, which are really what differentiate different school districts and students. And that means that because of the cuts we've experienced in education, some of our neediest districts and students have been affected more than others. So at one point, the negative factor was over $1 billion. It was $1.1 billion. And this slide doesn't go out to the current year. Basically, in the last legislative session, the legislature did put in another $150 million because they had the money into ongoing education funding. That brought us down to about $670 million that we're not giving to education that Amendment 23 said we should every single year. The past number, I don't know what the current number is. We can probably do the math, but we have been in Poudre School District here, we've been missing out on over $26 million a year in funding for many years. We're well over $200 million in Poudre School District just on what we've missed out on in school funding. And the state as a whole has missed out in $7 billion in education funding. We aren't asking for back pay, but we are asking for better pay. Now, what's happened with the pressures on the general budget and the Tabor cap, instead of being able to properly fund education, we have to do things like give refunds to voters. Now, the previous year, not this last year, but in 2017 in the state legislature, they passed Senate Bill 267, and that eased some pressures on the cap, but because our economy is doing well, unfortunately, it looks like probably next year or so, very soon, they're going to have to start issuing refunds to voters while we're still underfunding education. And could you bring up that next slide, please? And this slide, is just showing that, and actually this slide is slightly outdated. I was trying to get an updated one before the show. But Colorado currently ranks last, not second to last anymore, but last in providing teachers a competitive wage in Colorado. That means if I have a college degree and you have a college degree, if I'm a teacher, I'm going to make less. We do very poorly by our teachers in Colorado. Last year in Colorado, we had a teacher shortage to start the year of about 3,600 teachers in Colorado. So that means we're very fortunate here in Poudre School District. We're a fairly popular district to work for. We pay relatively well compared to a lot of districts. So we don't have as much trouble finding teachers, but there are still categories where we have trouble finding. But if you're in a rural district, a lot of times they have a lot of trouble even just finding regular subjects, like English, let alone very difficult subjects of staff like math or science. So the teacher shortage is a reality. I serve on something called the CASB board, which is the Colorado Association of School Boards. So I talk to a lot of school board members in other places, and it's a real thing, not being able to find teachers to teach your students because you can't afford to pay them enough. And when you have about 85% of your budget in a school district, that's about average, going towards salaries, and we're a people business, schools are a people business, in order to pay people more, we really have to have more funding. So that's pretty much the short of it. Oh, and okay. You wanted the numbers. We're about 39th in how we fund students overall, but about 49th in per $1,000 of personal income in how we fund it. So based on what we could afford to pay, we don't do very well.
Okay, well, I think we all know, we've all heard about the teacher marches in Denver and those kinds of things. So you've given us some good information on we're not paying teachers competitively. But what else has been the impact in the classroom on students with this lack of funds? I think that's important to address.
Well, as we said, there's hard to find teachers in a lot of cases. I know we have a shortage of science teachers, math teachers, special education teachers, and then just general teachers throughout the
So do the classes get bigger?
A lot of times we have larger class sizes. I know here in PSD, and don't quote me for this year. Well, I should be quoted right here on TV, right? But I've heard of areas where we have 40 or more kids in a class in high school, because that's what we have to have in order to make it work.
Okay, and explain for the viewers why there's such a difference. You said that Poudre School District does relatively well, but a lot of the rural districts, as we can see from the numbers that have elected to go to 4-day weeks, are not doing so well. Why is there such a discrepancy between the two?
That's an excellent question. Really what happens is districts like ours are able to pass mill levy overrides and bond issues so that we don't have as much pressure on our budget as other districts. We have, everybody gets per pupil revenue, okay? So we start out, there's a base level, but there are other factors that are applied. And as we mentioned before, those factors are what's getting eaten into with a negative factor. And so if you have a lot of students in poverty, for example, you might be receiving less funding in your district when you really need to have more funding in order to serve those students in poverty. So, and if you're in a very small district, district size is a huge component. And if we have 178 school districts in Colorado, they range in size from about 50 students to over 90,000 students. And it's kind of like going to Costco, right? If you're going to buy, big cans of olive oil or whatever it is, you can buy that at a cheaper price. If you have a district with 50 kids in it, your superintendent and your principal and your bus driver are probably the same person, right? And how many teachers can you afford? And so there are economies of scale when it comes to providing education for students.
And the state is not bridging the gap in this equity difference?
No, because they don't have the money.
They don't have the money.
And we do better. Any area that can pass mill levy overrides and bond issues is going to do better than areas that are unable to do so. And different areas in the state have different bonding capacities, right, because of the value of, and I'm sure Steve could talk more about that, the amount of personal property wealth and commercial property wealth that they have in their districts. So there's going to be different. One mill in Poudre School District is going to raise a different amount of money than one mill in some other area of the state.
Steve, you want to add anything to that? Not mill levies?
No, I don't. I'm not an expert.
Could
There
you-
we go.
Yeah.
I'm not even an expert at working this microphone. I don't pretend to know very much about school funding, although I did see this before. And what I think is interesting, isn't Wyoming number one on that? Yeah. So you move, 40 miles up north and your problems are solved. I'm joking. Kind of. All right. But no, I that interested me. And as far as the efficiency of Colorado in education, there was something recent that was published by Wallet Hub. And I don't even know who Wallet Hub is, but they have a presence on the internet. And it said that Colorado is extremely efficient and that we rank much higher than our funding probably should allow. And, I thought that was interesting. But I can't argue with anything that Cathy said, and she lives this.
Okay, I was talking.
On the other hand, I live the Gallagher Amendment.
You live Gallagher. We're going to hear from you on Gallagher.
We are.
Because that's one of the things that complicates school funding
Very
and
much.
and this bill that's proposed. So I live in a fairly new neighborhood, and I talk to people who have moved here from out of state. And I frequently get two questions. Well, don't schools just get everything from property taxes? And if not, why not? And then the second big question is, what about that marijuana tax? Why aren't the schools getting tons and tons of money because everybody's buying pot?
So I'm signaling for the right slide. So that is the slide that shows the difference. So it used to be that about 2/3 of our school funding for public schools in Colorado came from property taxes, and about a third came from the state. Over the time, those numbers have flipped because of these things called Tabor and Gallagher and how they react with one another. For instance, Tabor says that taxes can go down automatically but not up, and Gallagher continues to force them down. And I'm going to let Steve have the first take on the whole Gallagher thing when we get to that. But that's one of the reasons that's an issue. And then your other, do you want me to answer the marijuana real quick, or do you want to get to Gallagher first?
You want to explain?
Well, let her talk about pot.
All right.
Well, and honestly, so I'll tell you, I was one of the people who went all around the state because we actually had to gather 2% of all of the active registered voters' signatures from them from throughout the state in order to get this onto the ballot. And, when we're talking to people, the most common question that people ask is, well, what happened to all the pot money? Shouldn't marijuana be funding schools? We should have this great school system. And the truth of it is I really believe that the voters were misled on the pot tax when there was a $40 million shortfall in a building and construction fund called BEST at the time this was going on to the ballot. And what they did is they said, well, we're going to fill that in. And what BEST is a matching grant program for school districts. Our district is considered, once again, too wealthy to typically qualify for those funds, but it is a matching grant funding program. We call it our roof and boiler system. It's mostly for health and safety issues. So if you have a rural school district that has their boiler goes out so that they don't have a heated building, or if they have a leaky roof, they are able to apply for a matching grant funding in order to fill in the gap and get that taken care of. There's about $225 million in that fund, about $900 million in requests. And when you think of that, so that's for the entire state of Colorado, consider that it costs about $40 million these days with construction costs to build an elementary school. So it doesn't go very far. And it's not money for teachers and textbooks. The only other money from the pot money, the marijuana money, that goes to schools is for some grants, again, not ongoing money for teachers and textbooks, for drug counselors. But really, that's it. So it doesn't go very far.
Doesn't go very far. Okay. I think we're ready to take a look at Amendment 93, and I'd like to do an overview of the content of the amendment, and then go back and look at the pros and cons of each different section. So who would like to talk about the tax structure that's being introduced into this bill? Steve, you ready, or you want Cathy to start? Or
I can cover income because I used to be a CPA, and all CPAs did income tax at one time. And I don't like income tax, but I can still talk about it. The last state taxes you filed were based on a 4.63% rate of income tax. Okay. Amendment 73 adds 4 increments for personal income tax, personal filers, as well as an increase on corporate tax, C Corps, C corporations. The first additional level is at $150,000, and if you have, and this is based on your federal taxable income, if you have income over $150,000, your rate goes up just a little, but it goes up from 4.63 to 5%. And these are incremental taxes. If you go from 200 to 300, it goes up to 6%, 300 to 500 to 7%, and over 500,000 taxable income, it goes to 8.25%. Those are significant increases, and the amendment requires an adjustment in Tabor because the Tabor amendment says it's a single rate for income tax, 4.63%. That's it. So in order to implement this, the rates themselves and the income breakdowns are in statute. But in order to get permission to put those in statute, it has to modify Tabor. And then at the end, it modifies another part of Tabor and says, plus these revenues, these incremental revenues, aren't subject to Tabor revenue limits.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Explain tax increment. If you make $200,000, do you pay that new rate on the entire amount you make or just on the amount over $150,000?
I'm glad you asked that. And it gives me a chance to do a commercial for these financial impact statements that Legislative Council does. It's very, very good information.
Excellent source of information.
Yes, it is. I would be lost. I wouldn't even be here without them. So your question, it would go up $729 at 200, the average. Actually, that average would be for 250. But yes, it's only the part over 150,000.
So everybody gets 150,000 at the old rate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Now, and this is where I have a little bit of an issue. Yeah. On the C Corps, it goes from 4.63% to 6%, and that's a 1.37% increase. Now, in a lot of the materials and the discussions, that's what they talk about, is a 1.37% increase. It's a 1.37 percentage point increase in the rate. It's actually a 30% increase in corporate taxes, all right? So you have to understand that. Now, there's a little bit of fooling around going, just when they talk about the federal income taxes that were passed last December, all right? And that was the corporate rate went down from 35 to 21. So in some of the literature, they say, well, they're still getting an income tax rate because they used to pay 4.63% on top of 35%, and now they're paying 6% on top of 21%, which is 28%. So the wash is businesses are getting a tax decrease. And that's true if you look at it that way, but I'm just looking at this from the standpoint of Colorado taxation. And so that's a little, I know why you do it. I would probably do it too if I did that. So that's what the income tax segment is. And as I mentioned before, maybe I was going to, I think if they had stopped there, it would have been fine. It's still a big ask, $1.6 billion, but they account for it. And, there are a number of things that, need to be improved in education. And, the dollars are accounted for. If they stopped there, I think it would have been better. When they got into the property tax system, which we'll get to later.
Okay, we'll get to it. Okay.
That's where
so
things
that
fall
leads
apart.
us to where Steve started to go. Where will this money go? This $1.6 billion a year, which we have already been hearing on the TV, is the biggest tax increase Colorado has ever seen. What will this money be used for?
Well, can I mention something about the income
Absolutely.
tax first? So if you look at the slide on the screen, it will explain to you that even under this new income tax structure for personal income taxes, that 92% of voters will pay no additional tax. From the C corporations, it will take us from the third lowest corporate taxes in the entire country to the 9th lowest corporate taxes in the entire country. Colorado is really a very low tax state, so we really do not expect corporations or anybody else to be fleeing the state because we're trying to do something that, frankly, if you have a good education system, will increase our economic vitality in the state. Could you go to the next slide, please? And if you look at all of the income throughout the state or that people pay taxes on, all of the taxes people pay, not just the income tax. It actually helps to even out the curve. If you look at that next slide, so the current is how you see how that goes down for the higher income levels, whereas with Amendment 73, the line kind of straightens out. It's really trying to create a more equitable and sustainable method of funding schools in Colorado. But to answer your question is how will the money be spent, correct?
Yes.
Well, really, the advantage that this measure has over what's been done in the past is it leaves that up to local control. So we have, as I mentioned before, we have 178 different school districts in Colorado, ranging from 50 kids to over 90,000 kids. And all of our school districts in Colorado, when the Great Recession came along, also made different cuts. So not only did we cut different things, we also have different needs. And so this allows local school boards to determine how to best spend this money according to local values and local needs. So we really think that that's a huge deal because the state isn't coming in and causing unintended consequences by telling us you need to spend money on X, Y, and Z. As a local school board member, I'm going to say, you know what, in PSD, we're hearing a lot about the needs for mental health support in our schools and better teacher pay in our schools. So we can do what best fits our community values on every single one of those school districts in Colorado. And that's one really huge difference between this and previous bills.
Now, I understand that full-day kindergarten is on the table.
Yes, it is. That's really exciting. There have been legislators down in Denver who every single year in the legislature run the bill to try and get all-day kindergarten funding. So all-day free kindergarten is huge, especially for a lot of our young families when you're trying to figure out what do you do with your kid for the other half of the day if you don't want to pay for kindergarten and you work. How do you manage that? And, we have improved academic outcomes. I know some people in the past have considered that kindergarten all day is just glorified babysitting. Well, it's not. It's actually very beneficial to our students, and giving kids the right kind of head start really improves their academic futures and outcomes.
And how's it going to be decided how much each district gets?
So that's already out there. So it's according to the current finance formula, okay, and other factors. So can I just read it to you from this? So It's going to increase base funding for all students. It's going to obviously fund all-day kindergarten. It'll also increase 4-year-old preschool pre-K slots by $10 million. Colorado preschool program is what we have here in Colorado. It also increases state funding to local districts for English language learners, special education, and gifted and talented students. And it expands the definition of poverty to include kids on reduced lunch, not just free lunch programs, because it makes it a more equitable system. We actually had the superintendent's plan was up in the legislature because it is time. The last school finance measure that was adopted in the early 90s, and it's really time for it to be updated. I think most people agree on that. It didn't get through the legislature this year, but this says that we need to have a new one, and we truly do. So until we get a new one, it'll be developed according to this. But we have all of our superintendents in Colorado spent the last 2 to 3 years working on a new plan for school finance. It includes a lot of these types of things, but we are pretty confident that they already had an interim 2-year committee going in this last legislature. I think they wanted them to be able to finish their work and before passing any school finance act. And that wouldn't have gotten triggered until they had the money, and this will provide the money.
Okay, so you've kind of answered my next question, but I'll follow up on one thing you said. You talked about students on free lunch and free and reduced lunch. What percentage of students in the state would fall into that category? Do you know?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head.
Do you have the numbers for Poudre?
Last I knew, we were, I believe, a little bit above 30%.
30% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch?
That's the last number I remember. So I would have to go look it up and ask to get current numbers.
That's a significant number, because I would
kids.
guess there are a lot of school districts out there that are much higher than that.
Definitely.
Okay. So how about our local school district, since we're there? How is this going to benefit Poudre School District? We're doing pretty well. but why do we need this big influx of money?
We're doing well, but we can do better, right? We want to have a top-notch educational system for our kids. We want to be the best place to live in the country and be able to offer the best opportunities to our children. We do a really good job here in Poudre School District, but we are cutting corners. We are at the point where every time we make a new hire in the district, we're counting the pennies, right? We scraped together some extra funding this year to put some extra mental health supports into our school, but that was only done because it was a big concern. It was a huge board priority, and that was done after we'd made a lot of cuts at the central administration level, which I know people always complain about central administration, but frankly, central administration takes up less than 2% of our budget. So it's a concern. We need to do better by our kids everywhere.
Okay, so other people have talked about this is a funding measure without a sunset. Amendment 23 had a sunset. Other measures have had a sunset. Oh, we just need 10 years to get our feet back on the ground. This doesn't have an end to it. Who is going to make sure that school districts are accountable for all this additional new money? Is this built into the amendment?
Yes, it is. So the whole idea behind this amendment is to create a sustainable funding system which will stabilize and increase funding to K-12, pre-K through 12 education throughout the state of Colorado. There is part of this which talks about it requires in the ballot measure CDE to commission a study and the use of the money within 5 years. So there is an accountability there, and we just have to do better. But yeah, it's ongoing because we educate over 900,000 children in the state, and that's increasing every day as we have more people move into the state. We don't want to pull the rug out from under them once we start funding them. That's not going to work.
I wasn't a math major. I can't figure out what that is per pupil, but it doesn't sound like a whole lot. Okay, so let's talk about how this new tax will, be accountability. One more question. What's the cost of administering this fund? Is this going to add to the state bureaucracy to administer this money and to keep track of it?
Not significantly. The reason this money is put into a separate fund, what is it called? The Public School Finance Fund, I believe.
The Quality Public Education Fund?
Whatever the name of it is, it's put there because it's a separate place. It's a segregated place to ensure that that money is put aside and spent on education. As I said, I went throughout the state and collected signatures, and one of the things people wanted to know before they signed the petition to get this onto the ballot was, how is the money going to be spent, and can we ensure that it's really going to get spent on education? Because people often are skeptical that the money is going to be spent in the way that we believe it. They think that they're signing up for, right? As the pot money is a prime example. So we have a special fund that money goes into, and it also is required that this money supplement and not supplant existing education funding.
Okay. All right. Let's. Did we cover enough about? I think there's still a lot of people confused because the ballot this year could have 3 or 4 constitutional amendments. I know at least one statute got approved today to be on the bill. Anybody want to explain for new voters why we have all these different things and why in particular this amendment has to actually go into the Constitution?
If I could we'll go back to
Sure.
one of those. One of the things about this proposal is that the list of things, the special ed, gifted and talented, English language proficiency, preschool funding, it has a dollar amount, but they are all to be adjusted for inflation every year, okay? When we went back to, or going back to those, the income tax model, though that $150,000, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 levels are not indexed. And so that's another way that this is actually intended to grow as the economy grows and all that, But if you hold these constant and people earn more money, then you have more and more
money.
people making
Yes.
over. And that's intended in the program. But it also, all these things that are in the initial 1.6 or 1.1, whatever it is, these are all to be, as Cathy said, it's to supplement and not supplant. So the legislature puts in what they put in the year that passes, and then all of this new stuff goes in, and everything is updated or increased annually for inflation.
So this is 1.6 billion in addition to the money the state is now spending.
Yes, this is all incremental. And getting back to the special fund, I think the special fund is one of the best. I don't like the idea of restricting it from any other use in state government. But, with this much money, you better account for a well. That's advertising for accountants, so, hey. And I'm term limited, I could. No.
Okay, so constitutional amendment, statute, and referred items from the legislature. It's going to be a busy ballot.
And it relates directly to Amendment 73. We have a habit here in Colorado of sticking stuff in the Constitution that doesn't belong there. And some of that stuff relates to taxes. One of the reasons that, we'll get into Gallagher more, but one of the reasons that Gallagher is so troublesome is that it's in the Constitution and has been since 1982 when it passed. So that was quite a while ago. And you can't change it because it's so difficult to change things in the Constitution. You actually have to go through a whole new vote of the people to change something in the Constitution. It's true with Gallagher, and it's true with Tabor. And it's going to be true with Amendment 73 if it passes in this form. That's not the worst problem. Well, it's a bad problem. So, but that's one of the things that we do in Colorado. And everybody who actually works, at least in the property tax area, knows that putting things in the Constitution just makes things tough. I think most legislators feel exactly the same way. And I'll talk a little bit about a committee that's underway now. So that's a problem that we have in Colorado, and it goes through, the right to redress and all this and petition the government. And they're good reasons, but there's a reason why the United States Constitution is a fine document, and the Colorado Constitution just has a bunch of stuff in it that's very difficult to change. Now, some of the stuff is statutory, and I mentioned the rates and the salary breakpoints or taxable income breakpoints. Those are in the statute. So parts of 73 are statutory and parts of them are constitutional.
Now explain for voters who are new, what does that mean, statutory?
Statutory is where all the laws really go. That's where they should go. Constitution is where you want to carve them in stone, at least for a while. And that's just the difference. And Colorado is one of the easiest states to get changes into the Constitution and it still is probably one of the easier states. But did we decide that was Amendment 71 2 years ago? Yeah, 71 2 years ago passed, and it said, okay, what we're going to try now is if you want to make a change to the Constitution, it has to get over 55% of the vote, not just 50 as it was before. And you had, there are rules on petitioning and Cathy knows all about that stuff, but that's already been done and passed by the Secretary of State. So it's 55% to get this in, whereas 2 years ago it would have been 50. But if you want to repeal something out of the Constitution that passed by 50%, then it only takes 50% to repeal it, something like that. So that's the deal with the constitutional thing. Statutory things are still just 50%.
And there are some other, I'll just throw this in, there's some other weird quirks about single subject.
Oh, yeah, single subject.
Amendments have to be single subject. And then you have a bill like Tabor, which unfortunately is not single subject in and of itself. So there's a discussion of, well, why don't we just get rid of Tabor? But you couldn't do it because it's not single subject.
Right, and that's because the single subject requirement was put in largely because of Tabor. So anyway, but I guess the 73 did pass the single subject test so far, which is good.
Yes, it did. Okay. So, unless you have something to add to that, Kathy, I'm going to let, I think it's time to say, how does this tax impact other taxes in our state, such as Gallagher?
I'm glad you asked. Just briefly. The Gallagher Amendment passed in 1982, and it was to provide relief to homeowners on property tax. Noble intent, no doubt. When it passed, the assessment rate on all non-residential property was 29%, and the assessment rate on all residential property was 21%. A residential property is basically a domicile, someplace where you live. It's your house, your mobile home, your apartment house, your fourplex, townhouse, whatever. Non-residential property is everything else. It's commercial property, industrial, agricultural, mining, oil and gas, vacant land, personal property. So that's how it started out. And back then, I keep having to do this because I keep forgetting. If you divide 29 by 21, it's not quite a 40% premium that non-residential properties paid over commercial properties. The purpose of the assessment rate, and the assessment rate is set at the state level, statewide. It's all counties use it. It converts the actual value of property to what's called an assessed value. And it's the assessed value that the mill levy is calculated against to calculate property tax. So when Gallagher first passed, it was said, of course, the people voted for this, they're homeowners. There are a lot more homeowners than non-residential property owners, so they said, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. So that was in 1982. We started going on a biennial reappraisal schedule in 1987, okay? And we reappraise properties every 2 years, an odd-numbered years. And assessors run for re-election in even-numbered years. Isn't that amazing? So after the first biennial reappraisal in 82, they dropped the residential assessment rate to 21% or 19% first, because what happened after 1992 and Gallagher passed? Boom. The oil money left, Canadian oil money left, Texas oil money left. The vacancy rate on office space in Denver was the second worst in the nation, second only to Houston. We had a tremendous drop in the value of commercial and industrial properties. Well, part of Gallagher is that this is the balance. This is the theory back then, and it's still the theory. It just is kind of goofy. 55% of all property taxes paid statewide are to be paid on non-residential property, and 45% are to be paid on residential property. And you'll hear that periodically. It's called the 45-55 ratio or Gallagher ratio or fraction. So that's the balance that has to be maintained. Well, the only way to maintain that is making one of these ratios flexible. And so what they did, they carved the 29% in stone. It was 29% in 1982, and it's 29% today. And they said, okay, we will adjust the residential rate to maintain that 55-45 split. So if residential values go up too much compared to non-residential, then we'll drop that rate on residential, and that'll maintain our Gallagher ratio. So that was the idea anyway. Well, the irony is that throughout today, that rate in the 2017 reappraisal, that residential rate is 7.2%. So it has fallen from 21% to begin with to 7.2%. And so, if you divide 29 by...
You need the slide up now.
I don't know. 29 divided by, what did I say, 7.2? Now, for every dollar that a residential property owner pays in property tax, because of the 29%, the non-residential property owner pays $4. It's not just a 40-cent premium, it's a $3 premium for every dollar paid on residential property. And it's headed to $5 because the projected rate in the 2019 reappraisal is going to be 6.11%. So that's the Gallagher Amendment.
What's the impact that has on mill levy revenue for counties, cities, and school districts?
I'm glad you asked that too. Oh, it's almost like we're getting someone. No, the what happens, and this is kind of what Cathy was talking about. The numbers that drive the Gallagher ratio are a few of the 64 counties. Actually, we are either the last county that counts or the first county that doesn't count. That's where Larimer is. We're about 10th now. But, it's Metro Denver, it's El Paso County, Colorado Springs, it's some of the resort communities. But when you get out into Sedgwick County or Phillips County or Castilla or any of those other places, they don't have, of course, I'm the assessor, I'm going to say this, but, 15% appreciation every 2 years or more. And we had that in the 90s, and we're having it these days. It's kind of went flat a little bit during the recession, but, our property values are going up. And our median value is over $400,000. When I started being the assessor, it was about $78,000. So the problem with setting this as a statewide rate, the residential assessment rate, is that we do okay here. Business is still carrying a bigger and bigger burden every year of the total property tax, but on a per dollar of actual value basis. But, our residential rises enough, so we drop the rate, and there's still extra money in the residential assessments so that the county and Poudre and Thompson, they can maintain their budgets. That's not true in rural Colorado. It just isn't. And that's why there's been such a problem in Gallagher lately. And in fact, the Fire Chiefs Association, at the end of last session, tried to run a bill that would stall the 2019 reappraisal. Our last one was 2017. The next one's due next year. They want to stall that reappraisal because property values are still going up. And if assessors do that reappraisal, then that assessment rate will drop to an estimate of 6.11%. And those guys in rural Colorado just can't deal with that anymore. Fire chiefs have to buy trucks and gas and, whatever. And, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work all that well here. So that's kind of where we are. Now, I mentioned before that Amendment 73 is the big thing in education, Colorado education right now. But it's Gallagher that's the big thing in the bigger property tax world, because school districts take about half of the property taxes in Colorado. That's about it. The other half is split, between counties and cities and library districts and rec districts and water districts and what have you. We have a lot of those here. So that's the problem. And it's kind of the nature of Gallagher that, anytime you're living or existing or working in an environment that relies on taxes, except the federal government, it doesn't seem to bother them, but it's an environment of rationing. It's decisions. The legislature has to say, okay, schools and colleges, and that's just the reality of it. And that's why we have local options.
Okay, so how does Amendment 73 impact Gallagher?
Okay. One thing in Gallagher or one thing in 73 is that, and I don't know why they did it, but they said, okay, I just said the non-residential assessment rate is 29%, and the residential assessment rate is 7.2% right now, projected to go to 6.11. It's that way for everybody. In Amendment 73, they said, and I think it's because the income tax part ask was so big, they say they want to give property tax relief. So they drop the assessment rate on non-residential properties to 24%, and on residential properties to 7%, okay? So yes, that's a bit of a decrease, maybe. And both of those are now frozen, okay, in the portion that 73 does. The problem is that everybody else, the counties and the cities and all the other districts I just mentioned, are still stuck at the Gallagher. So they're still sending out, assessing at 29% and 7.2 or 6.11. From an assessor standpoint, it's kind of a problem because what Amendment 73 actually creates is a totally different property tax system just for school districts. Because all the values change. What's the value? What's the assessed value on your house? Well, now you can look at it and say, okay, as my house is $400,000 and it's 7.2%, and you do that, okay, that's it. That's not going to be the case anymore because, next year, what's the value on your house, or what's the assessed value of your house? Well, half of it, and it depends on your district as what the mix of mill levies are, but half of it is going to be assessed at 7.2 or 6.11, and half is going to be at 7. So you have this average assessment that really doesn't work for anything because the mill levies are all different. So that's kind of a nightmare. You want to talk about administrative problems. I think the state is not too bad.
Come on, Steve, just feed it into the computer.
I'm term limited. I don't know why I'm here. I'm just kidding. I'm here for the future. But it's a real problem and when you do that. There's another problem, an attendant problem, that has come up recently. And I wrote this piece. I know.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to. We have 7 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to be quick.
Can we have 2 hours? Can we do the sequel? There's another problem with the amendment, and it relates to what is called the Alternatives to the Gallagher Amendment Interim Study Committee. And I've been in contact with them. I've been in contact with the property tax administrator. There is a statement made in a lot of the materials for Amendment 73 that only school district mill levies are affected, in that their assessment rates go to 24 and 7 from 29 and whatever that floating rate in Gallagher would be. And they have good reason for saying that because that is mentioned in the fiscal impact statement. That statement is made. It doesn't affect other entities. But the Legislative Council didn't get that part right. And the reason is there's a notwithstanding clause. And those of you who deal with statutes, and that you always know that there's a notwithstanding, and then you have to, what does this mean? Well, the way they get out of Gallagher for 73, they say, notwithstanding the provisions above that talk about the 45, 55, and 29% and floating and assessment ratio on residential, notwithstanding any of that, we're going to change these assessment rates. Well, the problem is they didn't exempt themselves from the calculation of the 55-45. And so the Division of Property Tax and Legislative Council and whoever else wants to fool around with it will have to include right now all those numbers, all numbers from the 4 different assessment rates. The 3 fixed rates, 29%, 24%, and 7%, to calculate the floating rate that's left on the Gallagher residential rate. Now, I mentioned 6.1%, but if you go through all the machinations, that 6.1% has to drop to 5.2% for everybody who's not a school district. Now, would the legislature do that? I doubt it. They'd probably just throw up their hands and say 6% or 6.5% or something, because they can do that. The legislature actually sets it, and the legislature does not always follow the recommendation of the property tax administrator. Sometimes they can't, because the property tax administrator will suggest a higher rate than the current rate, and you can't do that without a vote of the people. So it's just a complexity that.
Thank you, Steve. Kathy, you want to throw in 2 cents?
Yeah,
and then I'm going
I'll
to
be
see
really-
if there's just 1 or 2 quick questions from the audience.
So the
out of
reason that
time.
we had to touch the property tax the property tax portion of this in 73 is because what happens that's different in school districts than for any other type of district in the entire state is that there's a per pupil revenue that the state sets for school funding. The property taxes pay as much of that as they can, as is assessed, right, out of their assessment value from the taxes that we collect. The state has to backfill the rest of that money. So every time that number drops, it puts more pressure on the general budget. So we said, you know what, at least for education, and we had to only do it for education in order to comply with the single subject rule so that we were only dealing with education. We said we have to at least solve this for education. So we're going to drop the rates and make them more equitable between commercial, because that includes like farmers and ranch land, which have been treated fairly inequitably in a lot of people's opinion, and freeze them so that we can have more equitable distribution of fund and put less pressure on the general fund in the state budget, which is ending up taking a lot of money for education.
Thank you, Kathy. Audience, I promise we will post as much information as we can on our website about the intricacies of this bill as we come across them in the next couple of weeks. Are there any quick questions out there? Okay. Steve and Kathy, I'm going to give you about 20 seconds each to explain why people should vote yes or no or maybe on this amendment. Kathy?
Frankly, the only way we can get more school funding for our public schools in Colorado is to go this route. Because of the stuff that's already in our Constitution, it does, unfortunately, I'm not a big fan either of sticking just random things in the Constitution, but this isn't a random thing. It's the only way we can get better funding for our public schools throughout Colorado. So we've had people working on this for over 2.5 years now to try and come up with the best possible solution, and this is what we've come up with, and we're certainly hoping that in 2020 there will be a better fix to Gallagher as well.
Okay, so Steve, has she convinced you that despite the complexities, it might be a yes?
Oh, so close. If they had just stopped after the income tax part. No, and it's, I think not intentionally, but, there are problems created by what they've done to the income tax or the property tax that just, they simply don't work. And as I mentioned before, it's in the Constitution. So I know there are a lot of people out there who are coming to the point who, are kind of tired of it. And if it goes in the Constitution, I'm going to vote no. And this is not a reason to change that. It's too big and it's too complex. And I didn't know it was the biggest tax increase in Colorado history, but I don't know. So it's just, and in Poudre, we're not in extremis. There are school districts that are in trouble. I know that. In Poudre, we're not here. In Thompson, we're not. And that's all I really know. But I just don't think they can make the case. Mechanically, they can't make the case. But if they can make the case on the $1.6 billion, that's...
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to our studio audience this evening. A solution for funding for K-12 education that best serves the needs of our children and our communities will be in your hands this year. Your questions and thoughtful investigation can help ensure a positive, long-standing solution. An informed citizenry is the cornerstone of democracy. If you are not registered to vote, do it today. This issue and others affect your quality of life and the life of your community. Be informed and join the discussion. Thank you.